post-media research network lecture series of GCTH from Key University, Seoul. And we have today Professor Andrew Culp. I'm quite privileged to introduce Professor Andrew Culp to the post-media lecture series that GCTH is organizing. Thanks for accepting our invitation and sending us the manuscript of your new book much before its publication. I consider this discussion suits well to our critical project. It started off with Slavoj Zizek's contemporary work, Hegel in a Wired Brain. Though Zizek's attempt was to encounter the cybernetic world from a Hegelian perspective, this book attempts to sketch a Deleuze-Guattarian response to the algorithmic logic of capture. I would say rather this book is quite timely as it envisions a new politics of resistance, especially as we are struggling to find new modes of weapon to escape the diagram of control based on the politics of imperceptibility, larval warfare, more importantly, a subtractive communism to overcome the microphysics of obedience and post-Foucauldian atmospheric environmental governmentality. This should be read against the general criticism or a general charge on Deleuze and Guattari that they are not politically enough. But your books, Dark Deleuze and the Guerrilla Guide to Refusal, is sort of a response to this charge at one level. And on the other hand, it is an attempt to discern a new politics, a new form of resistance, a new aesthetics, while laying out a larger project of refusal and a new mode of guerrilla warfare in the age of cybernetics. I consider your engagements with Deleuze and Guattari is to reinterpret the political in Deleuze and Guattari, or rather reconnecting Deleuze and Guattari to the crisis of the now. So what it means to reconnect Deleuze and Guattari? This was one of the questions that we encountered when we organized the World Congress on Deleuze and Guattari in Delhi in 2020. We were in the midst of student protest, where students were actively searching for a means to resist and refuse and to say no and to speak truth to power. This was one of the important points of concern, to envisage a new politics of resistance, a new form of guerrilla tactics, an imperceptible mode of confrontation, which is something more beyond the traditional forms of socialism, communism, anarchism, to sort of come up with a new form of politics. And I must say that your book was a real provocation to many of those young Deleuzians. So I just like to thank you again for sparing your precious time to come and join us and talk about what are very serious and important matters to us. So I would like to welcome Professor Andrew Culp, and I would like to ask you to sort of introduce your work.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much, not just for the great introduction, but for all of you to take some time today to, discuss these important matters. And I really appreciate being a sort of focus, but I'm looking for it to be just as much a discussion because you're amazing scholars who have really important projects in your own right. So hopefully we can really bridge to those very quickly. Yeah, me and my work. I suppose the easiest way to get to this is that I discovered philosophy before I discovered politics, but I did all of that before graduate school. And I had this sort of grand struggle in life to decide whether it would be politics or scholarship or intellectual life. And I tried various mixtures of both. I worked professionally in politics for a number of years, and I got fed up by sort of an artificial urgency and its professionalization. And to be honest, I got exhausted and I burned out from it. And so then I returned to the scholarly life because I thought that it was actually only there that we could ask some of these big questions that politics was trying to address, but that often didn't feel like it was getting at. And so then my intellectual life, I was reading quite a bit of Deleuze, and so I sought out Eugene Holland, one of the first big American Deleuzians. He himself had studied with Desartot, Lyotard, and Fred Jameson, and worked with him for a while, got my graduate degree, My first book that was published that many people might know me by, the Dark Deleuze Project, was actually just written in a summer after a blog post, and it wasn't really related to my dissertation. And the book that's coming out in March, the Guerrilla Guide, which is gone under many different names, sometimes about imperceptibility, sometimes about the metropolis, which is the sort of ground or figure of it. That was actually written before my Deleuze book. And so there's this sort of temporal disjunction that I've been dealing with, trying to sort of update the ideas and make these older ideas sort of fit in this world. And then, since then I've been actually working a lot on cybernetics. And I think that D&G play a sort of interesting role, and sometimes they're promoting it, sometimes they're criticizing it. And I think that that's precisely the moment we're in right now as well, where we're living in an obviously post-cybernetic society, but our resistance to cybernetics has become challenging. And so I'm very interested to seeing the sort of ambivalence of cybernetics and maybe what a post-cybernetic future, or sort of what comes after cybernetics. That's probably enough for now. But I have this new book. I'd talked to Joff a bit about reading some excerpts at some time. I don't know if this may be too early, but I would love to share some bits of that as the conversation gets rolling too.
Great.
Yes, Alex, go ahead.
Is it me? Okay, just yeah, I'm very happy to actually to get this kind of conversation over the Guerrilla Guide, to resistance and then refusal. Actually, reading I quite enjoy reading a whole stuff, and then found out very actually the interesting connectivity between the kind of historical the analysis of what we had in the 1920 and 1970 and 1980, and then you actually brought together lots of episodes that we are already actually known. For instance, the Red Army, the resistance, and then many actually hackers experience, and then actually the Occupy Wall Street, and then actually until today we had many the uprising, and then sort of many actually the organization actually against capitalist the technology, and as you said cybernetic capitalism. But actually in this sense actually your attempt to revive concept of guerrilla, as far as I know, you want to actually bring in actually the new concept of guerrilla, something, and that is very impressive for me, because actually as you know, actually the guerrilla warfare and the guerrilla actually something is very actually in my opinion the kind of modern tactic. Of course actually we already had this historical record, the Russian the people organized such a guerrilla warfare against Napoleon, the invasion something. But I think you what you discussed in terms of guerrilla warfare in your book is definitely actually after the Second World War. That means quite closely connected to the Third World Movement, across the world, and related to the kind of national liberation, revolution. Is in those days they call it. Is Bert Anderson also actually wrote about that. He's based on his experience in the China, the peninsula, like Indonesia, and then he also actually in Thailand. He had lots of actually the stuff about that one. But anyway, just in this sense, the guerrilla warfare seems very actually look like separated, the activity, or it seems very special, singular, the phenomenon, which already actually bygone. But you actually try to put a kind of link, what we experience today, and then actually such a historical experience. So that's I'm quite impressed by actually your work. And so, but actually, my question is, or some to kind of comment on your discussion, would be the what is the actually the purpose of the guerrilla warfare? Actually you put lots of such a tactical term. We need the guerrilla, the thinking, or we need the guerrilla, the resistance, or some resistance as such will be naturally guerrilla something, or some in Deleuze Guattari sense, might be war machine, actually escaping from the kind of state capture, you could actually build up your own identity or your own, in Gramscian sense, war of position, is based on the cultural, activity or against the mainstream of propaganda. But my actual question is, or my curiosity, my curiosity, what kind of agenda we can actually build up, today? Okay, just we already had that kind of tactic, the guerrilla tactic. Already we can collect this information and details of warfare from the historical, study, and as you analyze properly and then brilliantly. But I think actually what we are missing today, is definitely such an agenda, how we actually put together this guerrilla warfare, each guerrilla warfare based on each identity, with the, any, agenda. What is our common agenda, against capitalism? And then what we need after this, the end of capitalism, or what is the agenda of post-capitalism? Or if we shut down this cybernetic surveillance, what actually comes next? Something, I think people would be wondering, if they read actually your book. Yeah.
Yeah, so many wonderful, great connections and questions here. It's only maybe in the last few months that the Guerrilla has really moved forward. There was an introduction that I wrote maybe about a year ago that's not in the book anymore. I think I might publish it as a standalone article that emphasized imperceptibility, because it's this great process or concept in 1,000 Plateaus, and I think it goes in a slightly different direction. I mean, obviously it intersects. Whereas the Guerrilla was something that I had first started studying a bit ago. And I read all these sort of manuals and pamphlets that were put out, the Chinese guerrilla warfare for their national liberation struggle that then sort of starts going around and picked up just about everywhere else, Latin America in particular, a lot of Africa, throughout a lot of Asia, and even in the United States and Europe, there are groups who tried to apply those principles. I refer to like the Red Army faction and some other dissident guerrilla groups there from the 70s. And I think that in part, I think that era is over. So just to make it clear to people, just in case they're sort of worried that I'm prescribing some, sort of ultra warfare or something. I think that the era of the guerrilla is somewhat over, and we've had enough time that we can look back retrospectively and see how it made up an analytic system. Because as a reader or a thinker, what I love doing is reading texts and diagramming them, like figuring out precisely how they add up to a system, which I suppose is a sort of cybernetics of a sort, though D&G are really great at this too. I mean, taking a lot of different texts, whether they be literary, philosophical, artistic, or anything in between, and then figuring out like what is the underlying series of patterns there? How is there something systematic and rigorous and formal going on? And so I quickly found out that there was this unspoken connection between micropolitics or the molecular and guerrilla warfare. And in fact, that might be a way of updating the war machine for the 20th century. And it shows up sometimes when they're sort of making references to it. And so I was using it as almost sort of a foil to figure out, like, if that's how it worked in the 20th century, then we have at least some guideline to figure out what happens in the 21st and where we are now living ourselves. And so, going back to those references, I had never read this article that T.E. Lawrence, who often goes by the name Lawrence of Arabia, had written about guerrilla warfare for Encyclopedia Britannica. And I read it and I was like, wow, this is like reading 1,000 Plateaus. I suppose this is going around the internet now that the new Villeneuve Dune movie is coming out, and, Desert Power, right? But that's precisely, there's all these questions over how to confront an enemy who draws their power from creating lines. And that's precisely about the transcendent. That's precisely about the dominant state form. We have to problematize that a little bit with capitalism. It draws lines in a very different way, or as Michael Hart sometimes calls it, there's a becoming immanent of capitalism. So that's a sort of problem that we have as thinkers of immanence, is that it comes close to maybe the potential alternatives that we've been thinking of. And so that's the start of the book. And then the body chapters go into various figures of resistance. So I didn't want to just sort of map the problem. A lot of people do that. Marxists tend to do that. I consider myself a Marxist, but there's so many Marxists who focus purely on the diagnostic. And they're like, this is what capitalism is. And so the three main body sections, as you all know, the first one is on anonymity in a sort of anarchist tradition that goes through contemporary technoscience and hacking. And for that, it's a question of the intersection between the technical and the social, which I think is very important. So it's not the sort of Heideggerian dismissal of technology as just sort of like bad. It tries to understand, like, to what extent do you need to adopt some of the technical, but also for a social program. The second goes towards queerness, but also the criminality of queerness, the fact that it's always seen as sort of deviant, and tries to understand the various tools to come out of that. I think it's maybe the most psychoanalytic, because it picks up on this vaguely sort of Lacanian idea of polymorphous perversity, as well as the Foucauldian notion of sexuality defining contemporary biopower. And then the third part is on blackness, which I think exists as a global phenomena, but there's a group of American scholars who've been writing that are vaguely called Afro-pessimists, who think that the paradigm for thinking blackness shouldn't be coloniality, but slavery. So it sort of shifts the paradigm just a little bit. And so for them, it's about sort of impossibility of recovery. And so I think that that's interesting, especially when thinking about it in the context of sort of capitalist resistance. It doesn't just sort of fold all of those questions back into a sort of party communism or something. So those are the initial models that I work with. And then I know I've been speaking a while, so I don't want to monologue too much more. There's this one concept that I think is quite important. Where I was rereading the Rhizome Plateau, and under a very close examination, I was noticing how much they were appealing to not just the N+1, which is, the additive, where they, make that sort of joke in French where they're like, it's not about ontology and the être, it's about the a, so it's just adding more, the and in the and. But in fact here, it's the N-1. And so for them, when they look at a system, let's say capitalism as a system or a state as a system or whatever, their suggestion is to take out one of its determinate dimensions. And so suddenly it got my brain sort of spinning, and I was thinking subtraction. What does it mean to actually engage in a subtractive project rather than just an additive project? And so I think that that's the sort of main force and thrust of the book as well. So it's less about imagining a new future, and it doesn't necessarily make stakes or claims on what it looks like, and especially doesn't outline any blueprints for it. But it does imagine that the process to get through and moving forward is partially at least a subtractive one, which is I sort of doubly appealed into the underground, both in the sort of historic underground of people living these sort of concealed lives, but then also that it's sort of removing some of the ground. I really love this La Pujade book that maybe you all have read, Aberrant Movements. And he emphasizes the sort of posing a ground through DNG's philosophy and then removing the ground. And so I see that as a bit of the sort of movement to describe its shape or process too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, please feel free to chip in, like Dave, Joe. Should I?
Shall I go next then?
Yeah, fine.
So thank you, Andrew, for that explanation. Two questions. So one, why do you focus mostly on Thousand Plateaus? You know, your project seems highly political, and isn't Anti-Oedipus, which was born out of the May '68 uprising, you know, a much more politically powerful text in a way. You know, Thousand Plateaus was based on Gregory Bateson's ecology of the mind, and that's where they get the term plateau from. And it seems to be, you know, not as politically obvious what they're doing there. Maybe that's kind of part of the reason you choose it, but that wasn't kind of clear to me. And then you do resurrect the term communism, especially at the end. And again, it seemed to me that that kind of went against a lot of what you're saying, which seemed to be political, cultural moves about values and about, you know, not being part of a kind of capitalist mainstream, but yet actually explicitly saying communism as a, you know, a counter narrative to capitalism seemed to be quite contradictory to what a lot of what you were saying before that. So those were the two kind of obvious questions that came to my mind. So that would interest me for you to talk to those things a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd love to hear everyone here's experience with Anti-Oedipus and A Thousand Plateaus and some of the other books too. I mean, some of it is biographical. I think I know, well, you know, I would say I know A Thousand Plateaus and Anti-Oedipus about equally well. You know, they're books that I just read and reread, and they seem very important to me. I feel like Anti-Oedipus, in its sort of limited sense, is kind of a friendly critique of a sort of Freudo-Marxian synthesis that was popular at the time. And so to do the work of sort of extending beyond it sometimes takes more and more work depending on who it's meant to be in conversation with. Like a Zizek, sure, you can bring it to bear on things very quickly. But I feel like they sort of lay out some initial propositions or some ideas that then have to be worked out elsewhere, or they get sort of picked up in other places later. And I'm thinking, you know, when I was reading the Guattari journals on, you know, that he was keeping when they were writing Anti-Oedipus, he noted that Deleuze almost immediately, once they had sort of finished the book, started researching nomads and wrote the two plateaus of the nomadology, seemed to be sort of all consumed by it. And at least in English, they sort of publish it quickly. And there's a few different versions of it that sort of come out. I think there's the Rhizome one also has On the Line. It has like one of these like political essays that goes with it too. And so there's this sort of intermediary political period between Anti-Oedipus and A Thousand Plateaus that might actually be what interests me the most, which is this like hangover of the 70s, this moment of sort of collapse and defeat, the idea that some things go right, but a lot also goes wrong. And I'm very sustained by those. I think that the nomadology also tries to offer a, not exactly program, but outlines more of an affirmative or positive way of life associated with the nomad that we don't get in Anti-Oedipus. And so I think that that's the overall arch of the book for me too. It's like didn't so much need or want to diagnose capitalism for 200 pages. I very much wanted to look at people who are reacting to it. Groups have sort of picked up and responded to it in a variety of ways. Still in this sort of Nietzschean untimely sense. Like, I don't think I talk about very many people or groups who are sort of operating in 2021. I'm still trying to feel it out in a much more abstract way rather than sort of say what the most bleeding edge version of it is. But that might be a partial explanation on why A Thousand Plateaus shows up more. I don't know. How do you all feel about Anti-Oedipus and A Thousand Plateaus? I'm sure you all have very smart, incisive opinions about just sort of where they fit in a larger trajectory.
Job.
I'll jump in because I kind of yeah, it's good timing for me to say something. So, Dave and I are kind of, what can you say about Nick Land? We're kind of like vets of the Nick Land generation, you know, like, so in the 1990s, you can tell my age now, 1990s, right? So I was taken by Nick Land's interpretation of Anti-Oedipus, okay? And I was taken by it because I thought that this was the 1990s, so this is after the fall of the Berlin Wall and things like that, right? So then the idea of thinking about Marxism and communism, you just didn't hear it. And then we have this book published in 1972, right? So just after the événements in France. And then Nick reads it. Nick Land reads this book and as a totally new way for me. I mean, nowadays you talk about left accelerationism and the language has changed a lot, but there was like an intoxication with Anti-Oedipus, with Deleuze, and it was and you know, of course, you know Mark Fisher's work and things like that, right? So there's another person who was taken by this kind of very extreme interpretation of Deleuze in some ways, and I've never really, what can you say? I've never really come down from the high of it, from the intensity of that reading. And I think Dave might be like a little bit like that. So and then there was this interpretation of the difference between the two books, Anti-Oedipus and A Thousand Plateaus. And now we know that A Thousand Plateaus was written not by just Deleuze and Guattari, but a whole kind of bunch of students around him and things like that, right? So there's another thing going on with that book, but there's a discussion about A Thousand Plateaus as being a kind of recuperation, a kind of a question of health, managing desire and not kind of, you know, I'm sure you know this kind of distinction to be made. So there's that, and then, you know, your book that Deleuze came along, and the political reading of Deleuze is, we seldom hear it, and then you bring this fantastic book, and it's been translated into how many languages I don't know, right? And it has a real, it had a real effect to bring in the political to Deleuze and Guattari. And I'll talk about my take on it a little bit more. But one thing I was impressed by was last year when we were at the World Congress on Deleuze and Guattari, the first one in Manoji organized, and the Indian young scholars were very much taken with that reading of Deleuze, by your reading of Deleuze. So it had a real impact, and I was struck by it. And I know it. I read the book a good while ago, so I know how good your work is. But I saw the students kind of, they wanted a book like that, a political reading of Deleuze. So it totally, what can you say, gobsmacked me in a way, really. And then, yeah, so that's that. I mean, but anyway, that's, maybe we can say something about that. I don't know, but no.
That's remarkable. Yeah, I mean, I was a bit surprised, you know. I mean, maybe this is too biographical, but maybe that's what makes these things interesting. I remember when I was writing at the University of Washington, I'd sort of talked my way into getting a visiting position there. I mean, there was no money attached, but it was, you know, access to the library and a place to stay and some things like that. And it was maybe a couple weeks in, a week or two in, and I was just standing at a bus station, long day of writing. And I'm sure all of you know how it feels. You know, your brain feels like it's been squeezed by a vice or something. And I was thinking, God, they're going to denounce me. I mean, just like, they're going to say everything that I wrote was wrong and that it's a misattribution and it's a wrong citation. And I was like, you know what, I feel like the force is there. And, you know, for inspiration while I was writing it, in addition to just working really closely with materials, I was reading a lot of Nietzsche and other thinkers that I thought just like, for them, it's just as much the force of thought. You know, it's somehow harnessing the will to power than it is, you know, precisely the argument you're making. And you can make lots of veiled references, which I do too. You know, and it was so wild. But, you know, I was inspired previously by this French group that I think they're overshadowed by their later project, you know, many people know, the Invisible Committee, in part because they were dragged in front of the highest levels of the French courts, and they've been sort of on the global scene a little bit. But there was a small collective that they were a part of for only not even really 2 years, Tikkun, who I feel like they had a lot of that force and the power, and they'd read so much this material, but they were writing not in academic conventions. They didn't appeal to the authorities of authors. They were more than essayists, but there was something there. And so I really feel like I was in part writing their coattails. I mean, I really wanted to do something like that. And I think that's, in part sort of what Land does too. I mean, I have plenty of disagreements with him, but, don't we all? And maybe to sort of fold it back into what David had mentioned, it's like, I think I absolutely agree with the critique of communism if it means like the Soviets or China or anything else that would be that version of communism, or even party communism. I'm part of a very sort of heretical version of communism, I suppose. It calls itself less communist or ultra leftism, in which it sometimes appeals to democracy, but sometimes not even that. And it's much closer to anarchism, and almost the sort of turn of the century anarchism of really wild groups that would eventually sort of fold into the avant-garde, like the surrealists or Dada, and some of these other camps. And so I think that there's this sort of aesthetic project that most of communism is just more than happy to just sort of completely kill and bureaucratize or Stalinize or all these other things. But that the thing that appeals to me about it is not this sort of equality. I think it's a sort of Nietzschean communism, if there is even such a thing. It's very sort of, I suppose, paradoxical of sorts, but it's seen in figures like a Guy Debord or something like that. Maybe he's still a little too boring. But it's in one part sort of didactic, but then it's just so tied with demand for a intense, forceful living that I think there's really more similarities than we might think between these various tendencies that we're talking about, even if there seem to be very specific, let's say, like history of thought disagreements where it seems like they're falling on different sides of one another.
Can I continue, or Dave, do you want to say something in response, or?
Yeah, I could talk to both the Land and the communist. I could talk to all of it, to be honest. Putting my flag above my head, sort of. Nick Land was my PhD supervisor, which was quite an interesting experience in many ways, and he was a figure who, he went against the mainstream. He did do stuff which we look back now and we think, my God, he got away with that. He actually, and he stood up on the stage and announced the end of Western civilization more times than I can remember. And he did something with, there was some, as you said, his force of argument, thing. There was something about Anti-Oedipus that he found absolutely convincing, which he thought that in Thousand Plateaus there was a retraction. There was a sort of, it's almost like you go on a stage and you announce all these things and you come up with an idea and a system, and then hang on a minute, oh no, sorry, that was a bit much. We got too close to the truth. So it's for me, it's a question. It goes back to Alex's sort of initial, question about what is social change, and how do we enact it? And I think that Guattari on his own in many ways has some sort of good ideas here, and the fact that he, I think, ceaselessly looked to go beyond the very staid academic, filling all the dots sort of references type, but actually come up with a politics and an analysis that actually got people up and got make social change possible. And even though you sort of deny that a little bit in your book, and you kind of don't, as you say, kind of go down a utopic path, isn't that kind of, my question was, isn't that kind of just necessary if we're going to actually change anything? And if you're kind of always hiding and you're always subtracting, you always, even though it's very clever and you don't want to get caught, and that's great, but it's actually for something like climate change, for example, take an example, you don't really talk about that a lot in your book, but climate change and what's happening and what must happen for it to be, to actually successfully, survive this climate change problems. We've got this environmental crisis. I think, we actually have to be very, very positive, and we have to make a lot of these ideas actually happen. So I just wondered, be interested for you to talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think one thing that you mentioned was that there are some people who read like Anti-Oedipus as this sort of outburst, and then they like actually, put on their sober thinking caps and they go and they write the sort of like more serious working out in 1,000 Plateaus. And, it's a call for sobriety. It's a call for being careful, maybe blow apart a few strata while you're at it, but don't, do it too wildly. I hate that reading. I mean, just like, it's not the one that I'm on, and I don't not a jerk about it, but when it comes to it, I just like pretty much disagree on that point. And I think that there are these moments in the text where, I don't know, like 1,000 Plateaus is how many hundreds of pages. There's not complete internal consistency. And so I was just like rereading the 3 novellas Plateau the other day. And what's remarkable is inside of it, they have this tripartite structure in which, of course, it's like the transcendent and maybe the second figure, right? So maybe it's like the molecular. And then there's the third, which is their line of flight. And so they're already distinguishing between the molecular and the line of flight. And they're saying, like, don't confuse the smooth space and the molecular for a line of flight. And then they start referring to the molecular as rhizomatics as well. So they are basically distinguishing between lines of flight and the molecular. And it's not purely prescriptivist or anything. But I think it's so clear that so many people read a book like 1,000 Plateaus where they're like, okay, there's a hero and there's a villain. The villain is the transcendent or the state or what have you, and the hero is the molecular. It's like, well, yeah, not really. I mean, the molecular is just another framework for analyzing things through, and the line of flight even stands separate from those, and even perhaps stands separate from rhizomatics completely too. So I think that's part of what I'm trying to do in this book. How does this solve climate change? I wish I knew. I mean, that's kind of like the $100 trillion answer or what have you. I do know that the political groups that I like are not so much, pushing the cap and trade, or they're not so much doing engineering solutions. So some of them are doing low-key engineering solutions. Like, I'm a big fan of low tech. And I think that D&G are great thinkers to go to find sort of not high tech, but low tech solutions, which is to say still advancing technology, pushing it forward, but it's not like the latest and greatest that you're going to get from an R&D lab at IBM. It's people finding solutions that are sort of adopted. And that way it puts them almost in sort of a subaltern studies tradition that we've seen sometimes, but not very often, where it's like the cunning and the cleverness of people who are able to use their appropriative resources. And maybe this is the proximity to like a Levi-Strauss or someone like that, the Bruckelure, or the Desartoian tactics. But I think that that's a sort of really interesting dimension for me. And, in media and technology studies, there are some people who adopt D&G to take this perspective as well. It means that it, I suppose, puts them at odds with like the so-called left accelerationism of the sort of like big nation state planning stuff. But I always found it sort of bizarre for them to reference D&G too much because, so much of D&G, or at least their collective work, Anti-Oedipus, 1,000 Plateaus, and What is Philosophy, they're all highly anti-nationalist, anti-state. That really distinguishes them from other Marxist figures of their time. And so, or even just political thinkers of their time. So I found it very odd to see that wrapped in sort of like a big planning, big state project, whether it is like the Benjamin Brattons or the Cernick and Williams or what have you. But I don't know. I don't want to say anything too controversial because I think it takes a lot of approaches. But like,
say something controversial, Andrew. I dare you.
I mean, I have like Malm's book on my table too, right? So like direct action, I think is just
that is direct action. Don't blow those pipes up. Definitely.
Yeah.
Geoff?
Can
Yeah,
I?
oh, yes, go ahead. It's okay.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, fine. I really liked your book just because of two reasons. It's actually an unconventional political reading of Deleuze, which, right, we have a lot of political readings of Deleuze, which I think some of them are pretty conventional, like, how to kind of go about and how to kind of confront the political in the contemporary times. I just want to connect your book with the project that we are doing, like something related to post media or schizoanalytic cartography of post media. As you mentioned, there is an inherent tension when you look at the interface of technology and social, especially when it comes to political movements and all. There is a radical skepticism about the technological part, starting from Heidegger onwards, right? That inherent tension, I think, is there in Deleuze and Guattari as well. I think even Guattari is the one who kind of announced the possibility of post media, wherein which he focused on the liberative ruptures that can be pointed out in the post-media practices. But at the same time, the control apparatus, the control, the diagram of control also holds sort of a dialectic, wherein which you cannot really focus more on the liberative ruptures that a technological premise can offer. And most of the Deleuzian scholars, including Joe, are skeptical of like the focus more on the technological premise, or focusing more on the new practices of subjectivation, right, than the new technological premise. So I have seen, like in the protest in Delhi or in other protests in India, like the war machine or the tools that is being employed by the protesters becoming part of important component of apparatus of capture employed by the liquid surveillance assemblages of state at one point of time, right? So how do you look at this conflict and Guattari's idea of post media or schizoanalytic cartography of post media in that sense? I think this book also kind of connects to that idea in great sense. Yeah, I would like to have your response on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I wish I had a really concrete answer. I teach lots of media and technology classes. And so, I'm always thinking about this. I'm also in an art school, a really weird art school. It was created in the 60s, but really started having students in maybe like the early 70s. And it was a union between sort of like Disney and the whole Disney empire and animation and, what that would be, and Fluxus avant-garde artists who were practicing really unexpected experimental art. And so it meant the students were always sort of bouncing between these very two modes. And so I've taught a class after this great Fuller and Goffey book called Evil Media. It tries to look at the unexpected bureaucratic media and the ways in which those systems sort of operate. I'm teaching a feminist surveillance studies class right now, which tries to look at surveillance less as a sort of privacy concern about big tech and the boys who run it, and much more about the people who are the targets of surveillance, and perhaps have been for a long time, and so how they would sort of analyze and the way in which they sort of understand surveillance and respond to it, and sort of everything in between too. And so, I guess like a Hegelian would probably just like do this whole immanent approach, their own sort of like negative critique or whatever, where, the internet, there's always that funny joke in which like a real right-wing person will criticize, oh, you're complaining about capitalism from your iPhone, right? And then the like succinct tweet responses, well, I bet the feudal lords also found it really ironic when their peasants came with them with the pitchforks and the other tools, like it's just, people use whatever's available and the things that are there at the time. That doesn't give us an idea of sort of where it's going, right? And I think that the problem with that is that ends up being the sort of critique style approach, perhaps just coming out of the possibilities and problems of German idealism, where it's just sort of the revelatory mode, where it says, oh, people don't know, and if they knew and we told them how this technology works, then people would sort of get rid of it. And we know that that's not really completely true, because there are a lot of technologies that we know how they work these days. that even are rather unpopular, but they're either socially necessary, or we can't think of alternatives, or we live in this sort of, I guess, kind of neoliberal mode of thinking that there's no alternative. And so I would like to think of Guattari as this sort of like tactical approach of picking up the unexplored potentials of using something against its originally designed purpose. We get some of this, I think, kind of clearly in 1,000 Plateaus in maybe two different places. One, I think that, like, okay, everyone talks about becoming in 1,000 Plateaus, but I think the two models of subjection that we get that are really clear to me, and though they're only explored for a couple pages, is the social subjection of the classic, like, Althusserian ideology approach, which they say, sometimes it dominates, but probably not much now these days. Or if it does, it syncretizes with this other approach, which has sort of returned, which is machinic enslavement, which of course they get from Lewis Mumford and the Mega Machine, and has been explored quite fruitfully, I think, by Maurizio Lazzarato in his Signs and Machines book, which I absolutely love. I think it's great. I have small things that I might nitpick, but I think that it's great. And then we have this other moment where they distinguish between tools and weapons, which I believe is in the same plateau, maybe. No, yeah, it's still in the nomadology. And for them, they're distinguishing between tools, which are things that are designed to serve a purpose, and then they fulfill that purpose that they're designed for, which is a lot of what sort of design is these days, from interface design to web programming and that sort of thing. And there's so much effort done to sort of make people use apps the way that they're designed, and making that as much of a closed circuit as possible, especially with the free labor and the extraction that comes from it. And then there's the weapons-based approach, which is to, like, break it up, break it apart, use it in unexpected ways to have either high or low intensities or in unexpected combinations. And that might just be a little bit like tinkering. Reminds me of this art movement in the 90s called tactical media that I've taught on, and I like teaching about sometimes. But I think tactical media was totally short-circuited by Web 2.0. All of the promises or all of the political aims of tactical media was more representation, more access to tools, to be able to have your voice heard, to be more networked and all these things. And then Facebook was like, yeah, great, let's make that into a business model. And so we now have this way in which all of those sort of demands of 90s, let's say, people kind of associated with net art, wanted things to happen. And I think that they've sort of gone bad. They've been sort of perverted. They've been captured. And I'm not exactly sure where things are going to go. And I think that that's the big question for us. Like, if it's not just about demanding for excess or getting more availability of tools or connecting with larger groups of people or all these things that people have been asking for in the 90s, then like, what is it? What are the ways to, jam the gears and come up with a different approach? But I'd love to hear from you all. I mean, I'm sure you've been thinking about it for quite a while.
Well, I was going to try to jump in there, and I was wondering about the audience for your book. You were writing the book for. I mean, is it principally high-tech youth, or, as you said, a kind of low-tech kind of finding a kind of opacity in using technology in a different way? It seems to me that I guess one of the, like, we shouldn't really be terribly critical, but I was wondering who the audience is. It seemed to be that you're writing the audience for an American youth. I mean, would that be right, or that would be just right? Anyway, yeah.
I mean, there is an American centricness to my writing that I really need to work on getting rid of. Part of it's just sort of the air I breathe, and so it takes a lot more work to sort of get beyond that, and I'm absolutely guilty of it. For my previous book, which was a book of philosophy, strangely enough, a lot of the translators into other languages don't even work as academics, and so that's certainly one of the audiences, which is people who read theory, whatever that means. People who read theory, but aren't necessarily trying to make what they read immediately relevant to a research profile. And who are interested in sort of pushing their political imagination. Obviously, I'm trying to sort of push some Deleuze studies buttons. That's sort of always there. And then, broadly in the US, there's this academic formation that I'm sure you're sort of familiar with that was like cultural studies. And it has, its British heritage is much more interesting, I think, because it was always tied to a certain version of like doing politics. I'm not exactly politically on the same page as the British version of cultural studies, but I think it understood what it was trying to do in a way that I think American cultural studies just like never figured it out. Everyone said they did cultural studies at a certain point and completely diluted it, and it didn't have a sort of clear idea of what it was doing. And so if I were to summarize, it would be like to make interventions. It's very interventionist, I think. And it's not an intervention to be evaluated on purely political terms, nor on purely intellectual terms either. In fact, we watched this great documentary on surveillance in my surveillance studies class the other day called All Light Everywhere. And we were also reading some Saidiya Hartman, who's basically picking up on this sort of James C. Scott infrapolitics stuff, but in the context of Black studies. And in both those classes, we're asking, like, what if we evaluated these as aesthetic projects? Not aesthetic in some sort of question of taste, but like, what if we like fuse politics and aesthetics and use that as a system of judgment or evaluating like value or success instead? Like, what are we going to come up with? And I think that's kind of where this book exists too, where it's trying to understand politics as an aesthetic and a cultural practice, and that can help guide how to understand it and how it operates.
Right. Can I just continue? But that question still is kind of there, who you were writing to. So I was thinking, like, you mentioned the whole idea of the lumpen proletariat, the kind of criminal kind of hacking movement. I thought maybe he's writing for those people who want to kind of disappear, to be imperceptible, to kind of get off the grid. That would be, I guess, consistent with your low-tech kind of, like, not necessarily a full-on embrace of technology, but finding a way to kind of get off grid a little bit. Would that be right? Or
sure. Though, then, I also like the idea of hackers as they're a very odd mix of both high tech and low tech. And I think that's also kind of autobiographical too. I'm interested with people who have very high technical know-how, but don't choose to just simply, be a wage earner and sell those services to the highest bidder.
So the guerrilla then would be, where would you find the guerrilla then? In the slums or in the kind of, in prison networks and things like that? Is that
all of those? Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. There's the specter of the urban guerrilla that the U.S. military has been obsessed with, because, the U.S. military themselves, some of the first cyberneticians, of course, always do this projected future planning, and they try and sort of future-proof their own power. And so certainly in the National Liberation days, they were some of the first people to translate guerrilla manuals in English. Like the people who translated Mao's guerrilla warfare was a Marine colonel or something. And so they have been really worried about urban guerrilla warfare. And that certainly happened in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Well, I was going to say because of the, Guerrilla had the same problem, right? And you got the Israeli kind of military reading Guerrilla and Deleuze Guattari to try and make sense of the rhizome or lines of flight, things like that. So my question would be, is your book heading that way for its military recuperation?
I'm hoping it isn't. It always can. The people who made A Coming Insurrection or The Coming Insurrection be a bestseller was Glenn Beck, this like far right-wing commentator. He talked about it on a show, and suddenly it was catching headlines, and they sold thousands of copies and probably funded Semiotext for a few years.
Can I get it? The relevant to actually that discussion. All right. So the actually development technology is as for the cybernetic capitalism. Many actually liberal actually theorists and then economists argue that this technological development would bring in more decentralized society. But in my opinion, actually, as the technology developed, I think centralization, the goes strong, the go actually tighter and tighter. What I mean, more intensively actually centralized. So, for instance, actually, the after the capital occupation, the Twitter, immediately stopped, the Trump's in tweeting, and then actually the people didn't question, as Zizek said, who decide to actually stop, the quit, actually the get, the kick actually Trump out of the Trump, the Twitter. Why is that? Is who actually decide that one? Nobody questioned that one, but actually, of course, it's CEO of Twitter, no committee, no political decision, but simply actually CEO's decision, company decision. And similar thing happening in the recent disclose in the Facebook, Also some actually small, the people, and mostly the Zuckerberg, to decide whether, which actually information must be allowed or not. That means as a centralization goes on, the stronger and stronger than actually before. And that means that what is that? Exactly, actually, you also discuss it in the vantage point, decentralization would produce more actually the vantage point. It means actually more flights for line of flight, and there were one machine could the escaping from that kind of state, the capture. That's why I actually quite happy to read your actual work in very dangerous book. You talk about the vantage point and the decentralization, or the keep producing actually more actually the invisible invisible actually entity, and the invisible place, and invisible logistic actually mobility, something like that. But actually the problem is that I think physically, politically, and mechanically, actually, we can see that. We can actually say that. Lots of vantage point and many actually holes, actually unrepresented, invisible, something, that would keep increased, or escalated, toward that kind of crisis or something. But the people, didn't have, the kind of intention to joining this, the movement. That means actually, it seems actually, even actually during this pandemic, I witnessed people desperately try to stop, being into that kind of situation. That these guys, actually, this is normal life, something like that. One of them is, I think, European demonstration protest, against the masking, their paces, something like that. They want to be a normal, actually not want to be actually very abnormal situation. That's a problem. So a little bit kind of, the problem of determination already discussed by Althusser, actually what actually decide, what actually determine that actually they change. They must change their mind, who determine that one. What actually caused, that kind of, change? It's not the technology. Technology would produce that kind of condition to change, but what actually caused that kind of change? It's not technology as such. It's not. People must be actually join that kind of engage with that kind of guerrilla warfare. But before that, who actually decide to be guerrilla? That is my question, and then also my dilemma.
Yeah. So much there. Love this quote in one of his essays on Foucault, where Deleuze says, technology is social before it's technical. I think that's absolutely the case, in that maybe in this just sort of like context of production question, but it's like, every technology produces the social world in and around it. Someone like Stiegler, I think, is pretty good on this issue, if you ignore some of the later jargon. But I think you're right on this decentralization issue too. There's a security practice among hackers and information security professionals now, where they will tell clients to not have flat networks, which is to say a network where one computer will have access to all of the other computers, because they think that it's too much of a security risk, and they suggest not only giving a complex permission system, but they equate it to, having a large ship, like a cargo ship, having multiple different ballast chambers, or whatever they call them, and having them sealed and separate. So if you breach a hole in one area, the ship still stays afloat. I think that's precisely how all kinds of digital networks are actually constructed when you look at them these days. Like, you still might have a connection point between various things, but that they are regulated and filtered. And you can centrally command things quite quickly, like you're saying with Twitter and their banning of Donald Trump. And I'm deeply scared that there are just these committees who say they're beyond politics, and so we have this whole post-political issue. They have no accountability, so that means they're not even democratic. Like, I would like a world that is even more free than democratic, and this is less free than democracy. And they're making these decisions based on legalistic but non-legal user rights agreements that we don't get to negotiate. We just have to click yes or no when we join websites. So I think that there's going to be more and more of that. There's going to be this proliferation of technocratic decision makers who come up with policies and mission statements and all these other things that I'm sure that you all have to deal with at your institutions and universities that don't really have legal bearing, but they start guiding and regulating practice. And that the internet, because it appears to be this objective technical platform just driven by machines, is ripe for this type of thinking. It's also about the appification of things. And for me, the way I get around it is that I like asking questions about form. And part of that is I get to ask these sorts of questions because I'm at an art school and they're obsessed with form. And when you say media or medium in an art school, people immediately know what you're talking about. They're like, oh, is it painting or is it sculpture? And so media becomes very quick and very easy. And then I actually teach with a lot of creative writers in my program too. And they like to experiment with form. They're not tracked. They don't just do poetry or prose or something. And so we're always talking about, like, what's the form? And we always ask the students, what's the form of this? How is this going to function? It's a bit abstract, I mean, it goes into this sort of like modernist question of abstraction. But I think that this suddenly starts getting us a new form of media critique that I find very interesting. So I like, I don't know if you all have read, I think it's Zelinsky's End of Media book, came out by that, at least in English, one of those imprints of Minnesota where they do the nice letterpress and
Univoca.
Yeah, exactly. So he does this sort of like intellectual history of media and media studies over the last 100 years that very much ties it to particular theorists, but what's going on first in television or maybe even radio, and then moving through cinema and the contemporary. And so that's how I generally think of these issues too. So like, if the internet was like the network, then we're sort of in a post-network right now. And when I look at the things that the activists and political people that I know are trying to construct in terms of their political interventions. Like the police here, probably the police at where all of you live, but at least the police here, they can intercept cell phone and other communications, especially through like pineapples and other like Wi-Fi interceptors. And they even shut down or do radio jamming. And so people have started inventing like ways to have informal networks that run when those large connectivity to the internet shuts down, so the people in the immediate vicinity can sort of relate to each other once again. Or even other mobile technical devices that are able to put people who are immediately in proximity in some sort of coordination, and that it's not sort of going all the way out, looping out into the expanded internet. I think we're going to see more of that. I think there's a popularity of private chats or private group chats where 5 to 500 people all talk together, but it's not hosted on a platform like a Facebook or a Twitter, or if it is, it's all private. So I think it's this mix of this new return to the concealed or the opaque or the private or the partially local, but still in a somewhat networked function, but not because it's trying to connect to everybody, but because it's just a convenient way to sort of work with people who've temporarily come together to form a collective. I see that as maybe where we're going right now. But I don't know. I'd be really curious to hear what's going on in your regions, because that's just what's happening in Los Angeles. You know, things could be happening completely different in your side of the world.
Oh, Manoj, do you have
Go on.
something to comment about the Delhi riots and what happened there with the police and the?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, my question was actually as a sort of a response or sort of a reflection on what happened in Delhi during the riots or Delhi during the protests. I think Alex and Joe were there as well. They were visiting professor to our university at that point of time. So I was just asking, I was just curious about, and one is a conception of like when you talk about the media studies and intellectual history of media, then very notion of medium, like the primacy of the medium, as McLuhan says it, or in Guerrilla also you can say, going back to the phenomenological aspect of the numbness of the media, I think comes back again in Guerrilla. So that sort of question comes to the fore, and I was thinking very clearly on these aspects, like when I was talking about post media as well, like how to kind of take account of the dissident aesthetics of resistance that being put forward by the students. And I was thinking of it in a sort of a Guattarian diagram, wherein which you have all of the different universes of reference, kind of making it possible, so much of enunciation possible. So you have all other things coming together, right? You know, it's you have this the religious framework, you have other frameworks coming in to kind of create that subjective mutation, right? And it's not only the technology, but I was really very much suspicious about the technology part, because the very weapons that they used, right, and the protesters used later become the apparatus of capture by the state as state. It could, so when you switch assemblages, it can function completely in a different way, right? So it could be a sort of explained in terms of an assemblage or how it functions. You can loosely interpret it that way, but still, I also kind of share the concern with, like, you know, the skepticism that we can have towards technology in that sense. I'm not really saying that, no, in a Heideggerian fashion, it's not like it's an evil sort of stuff, but still, that tension is something quite relevant for me. And I think while you're interpreting it, it is actually reinterpreting the tension that is already there, like, you know, between the technology and the social, where it comes, as you said rightly, as Foucault says, technology is primarily social, right? I completely agree to that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where a group like the Red Army faction or other German militant groups of the 70s get really interesting for me, because, like, was the RAF successful? I mean, I mean, I don't know. They had a sort of like stupid Leninism that I don't have any, I don't have a lot of sympathy for, but they were great at being media figures. Mm-hmm. They grabbed headlines, you know, and they were film students in Berlin previously. I don't know if you all knew this, but they were film students. And in fact, some of their contemporaries include the great sort of like art filmmaker Harun Farokhi, who's like one of the great sort of media critics through film. And so they knew precisely what they're doing. And some of the other groups who were, I think, a bit more proletarian, like very just working class people, like Bami Baumgarten, who was part of the June 2nd movement, and Red Zora, which was like the feminist one. They were even more kind of like fun and subcultural and interesting. Like they would like print metro tickets and hand them out to everyone. So they're just totally like defrauding public transit, or they're just like getting people free food vouchers and they're handing that sort of stuff out. Like I love those sort of hoaxes and pranks that involve a certain understanding of the media of their time, where it be print media or cell phones and how they sort of operate. And you're right that it doesn't have a huge horizon, because it still relies on this infrastructure that's controlled by, people who really don't have their interests in stake. And I think that's going to be our big sort of question moving forward, is that no matter how effective we can make interventions on Twitter or on TV or in a film or all these other questions of representation that are really popular with politics these days, there's a deeper infrastructural issue of the communication channels and the network and the actual the logistics of it that aren't really controlled, or that are tightly controlled, but people who don't share a sort of liberatory agenda. And so like, what would that require? What would that take? I think that probably, like in other places, land struggles is one way in which people push back against it. Another one is struggles over logistics itself, everything from truckers to the water protests that happen here, or environmental protests, I think actually link up to it in an unexpected way. Or people have ways of life that try and maintain some relative autonomy or separation, like indigenous peoples. But for me, I think mixing that sort of like a conservation of traditional way of life plus people who are like punks and queers and other people who are like really pushing it forward, that's where I sort of like to see the intersection. Like, I don't think it's just about protecting something. I think it's very much about maybe a sort of accelerationist push at the same time somehow.
So as for metropolis, the one struck me is your discussion of metropolis and then urbanization. And actually nowadays, the most of the population on this Earth is actually living in the city. Yeah, it's already actually more than half. But actually, the thing is that this actual situation, causes more, dangerous. The possibility. What I mean, actually, the possibility of danger or something. It might be a more risky. The state. For instance, yesterday in Korea, we had some one of the big communication companies, KT, Korean Telecom, had some problem, to actually transmit information. It's 40 minutes, and it caused a total chaos, right? And then few years ago, and then also the one of the actually base, the building in Korea Telecom also had fire, and then it caused actually the blackout the whole day, something like that, and the all actual economic mobility and all actually the information and the communication, even broadcasting, in the internet, all stop. And then this is what I mean, actually, kind of it would cause standstill of this civilization, and then that means actually guerrilla, would be a very actually dangerous, something, for this, the whole, mechanism. That's what I mean. This guerrilla is not kind of, some epistemological actual invisibility, but like ontological state. That means which cannot be captured by the kind of representation system, what that kind of, actually controlled by this mechanism. Actually, always actually this power is leaking from this, the whole technological surveillance. So that's what I'm thinking. Condition is all set, but people try to protect this system. That is a quite a different point. And then, in my opinion, the Thousand Plateaus is about this one. More like the German ideology rather than the capital. Anti-Oedipus actually more discussed about the mechanism of capitalism, like Marx, capital. But the German is Thousand Plateaus is a little bit different in this sense. So, could you actually tell me what you think about the distinction between Anti-Oedipus and the Thousand Plateaus? I think you seem quite put emphasis on Thousand Plateaus. So my position as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's very thoughtful and great examples. Maybe we'd even discuss or call what we currently live in, not just cybernetic capitalism, but maybe transversal capitalism, because there's this sort of multiple unexpected investments in social formations that otherwise would have been molar and separate, and the sort of molecular capitalism that makes these transversal connections creates some very unexpected complicities or alliances. It goes both ways. So both, if the internet accidentally shuts down, it means all life ceases for 40 minutes. It also means when Iran tries to shut down their whole internet to stop the protests, people who just wanted to share cat pictures or be in touch with their family suddenly feel like something is happening very personal to them. I'm doing an art film right now with someone who found this very creative prankster group that bombed computers in southern France, in Toulouse, in the early 80s. No one was killed, but they did these sort of arson attacks. And they would go in and get personnel files, magnetic tapes, and computers, and then destroy them in like bathrooms, basically. And they would sort of write about this. But what's interesting is at that point, it was really easy to know what those computer companies were and what they were doing. And people would either care or not care based on how they felt about the military or the specific corporate work that they were doing. You know, a lot of it was military computing. And they were it was often after some sort of military intervention that the program helped do. And so, you know, a lot of people just couldn't care less because like, oh, okay, they you know, prevented a military program from happening. Whereas if that were to happen today, people would, you know, feel like a part of them were being cut off in this very prosthetic McLuhanite way, you know, like, oh my God, I don't have my phone. I've lost a part of my person. In his sad way, I think like Stiegler just sort of lamented this and he's like, oh no, we've sort of lost some sense of ourselves now that we've sort of been disseminated into these wider networks of technical systems. It's not exactly my approach, but I don't always know how to respond to it. You know? I don't always approach it as a philosopher. I sometimes approach it as a partisan. I say, well, how can we make something out of this?
So perhaps turn on sound.
Yeah, I was trying to think about a question about Stiegler, but I'll just keep off that. It's a bit too close to my nose at the moment, too sensitive to it. But I'd like to turn to the question of anarchism, because it's something that's been with me since I was before I was a teenager, actually. So I think that you, again, in your new book, you actually capture the zeitgeist almost, really, by thinking about what anarchism is and what philosophy is and what is that relation. And there are other people, as you know, who I don't say picked up on it, but who are writing about it. I mean, Catherine Malabou, her book's going to come out next year on why anarchism is kind of, what can you say, has been kind of banished by the history of philosophy. And in her work, you know, she picks up on Kropotkin and Proudhon, and she criticizes them for their weak philosophical positions, but she notes that this kind of absence in the history of philosophy. And I think, again, you actually touch on something, and why the question is why anarchism has become an idea that's gaining currency in the present moment. And there are Deleuzians, of course, who are writing about Deleuzian anarchism, like in South Africa, Chantal Gray and Aragon and people like that. But that tradition also has some history as well. I mean, Todd May and Saul Newman, and the guy I always liked was Arthur Redding. His book on violence, what was it? Raids on Human Consciousness, I think. I always enjoyed that. So I guess my question is like, is there some kind of, what is the philosophical sense to a kind of Deleuzian anarchism? I mean, does it make sense to say you can treat Deleuze philosophically as somehow touching upon a kind of anarchist sensitivity, if you like, or but that's one side. The other side is what can Deleuze learn from the history of anarchism? What can like a Deleuzian philosophy of difference pick up from the history of anarchism?
Yeah, what a great question. So I have to admit that I've been sort of reading and involved with anarchism since maybe a late teen. And I need to actually systematize it at some point. For me, it's more like the water that I swim in. And I've actually been a bit hesitant to cite more of the things that I read. Not even sure why. There's a sort of dissident anarchist tradition in the United States that tries to distinguish itself from socialism. Because there's a lot of anarchism that's just sort of like socialism without the state or something. And so it's very much about humanism, and that some of their figures, I think, sort of emerged at the same time as a sort of Marxism. I think even, the famous utopian socialists that Marx and Engels denounced in the Communist Manifesto, many of them were sort of founding figures of modern anarchism. And there isn't exactly a break between 19th century anarchism and contemporary anarchism, but it almost feels that way because the historical heritage wasn't sort of maintained in the same way. Because like Marxism, at least in my mind, isn't so much about Karl Marx the person, though, I mean, he's funny and interesting to read, but it's the body of work that people have sort of put into to make it what it is. Whereas anarchism, I don't think has figures that people treat in the same way. Or if they do, they just sort of like stay with the classical figures of a Proudhon or a Kropotkin or a Bakunin or someone like that. Whereas like the figures I like from that era include like Renzo Novatore, Luigi Galliani, Johann Most, like people who were really active. They were giving lots of speeches. They're reading tons of things. They were reading tons of philosophy and devouring it. But for them, it wasn't about constructing this sort of like philosophical project about human nature. And to the extent that they did, they sort of failed. And I think that I haven't read all of Malibu's stuff on it, but I think that that's what she might partially take them to task for. That's what I think Deleuze would take them to task for as well. This sort of naive Rousseauian idea that human nature was great until the evil institutions of corruption came in, and if you just throw off the institutions, suddenly benevolent human nature will reemerge. Even like a figure like David Graeber kind of slides into that sometimes. There's this other tradition that's like subcultural. It's related to the avant-garde. It was associated with youth movements. Sometimes it's intellectual, sometimes it's not. And that's what I draw a lot of my inspiration from. The people who distribute it here in the US are a press called a distributor called Little Black Cart. And it's kind of, they're weird, but there are some of the people who are behind, let's say the WTO 99, earlier, going back to some 70s, going to the contemporary as well. But like, what is D&G's relationship to this? Okay. This is something that I've been struggling with because I feel like there's an easy answer and then there's a hard answer. The easy answer is that D&G sync up with the sort of, let's call it metaphysics of cybernetics. That's about spontaneous self-organized systems, especially sort of like second order and after cybernetics that goes through chaos and complexity theory. And that might be one version of what nomadology is for them. Just all Prigogine and Stengers and, all that kind of stuff. I used to really like that. And the more that I read it, the more suspicious I've become of it because I think that it's been incorporated into capitalist planning in a very sophisticated way at this point. And that it has allowed them to insulate themselves from too much deviation or challenges. So I was quite convinced by Tikhon's cybernetic hypothesis essay. It's maybe the first sort of turning point that I started happening. So I think that the importance of anarchism is maybe to help find a way to break past simply being warmed over cybernetics and for it to become like a weird cybernetics or a diaper cybernetics or, I don't think necessarily have to block the cybernetic paradigm completely, but I think you need to find the lines of flight or the more weird or the more strange, which I guess was already what Land's project kind of was. And he sort of, I guess, abandons it or it becomes too difficult for him at a certain point. But I would be very interested in sort of like figuring out how to pick that back up. Right now, the project on that I'm thinking is called control freaks, you know, because like control coming out of the cybernetic idea, and then freaks being like phone freakers, people who sort of like hack it, and thinking about like what are the ways in which you can freak or hack cybernetics to sort of push it beyond its own limits and take it into something else. But still just kind of figuring it out at this point.
Mm.
Kind of raise one point, right? Which I think that is the relation between Foucault and Deleuze. Am I audible? Yeah, the relation between Foucault and Deleuze, right? You know, when Foucault kind of comes up with a differential notion of power, something which dispense with something substantive or hierarchical conception of power, right? Oh, so what we can call sort of a microphysics of power, wherein which the power itself is considered as a differential derivative, where you cannot really come up with no predictable patterns or definable strategies or identifiable locations of power. That itself becomes more so, wherein which you can say, like Lacerato talking about modulation by mind, molding of individual by the disciplinary segment, and management of population in terms of biopolitics, right? So when these three comes together, right, I guess like Foucault and Deleuze sort of share a lot more about, like, you know, in terms of the differential aspect of power. So would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great topic. You know, I came to Deleuze through Foucault. I read a whole bunch of Foucault in college, and it won my heart over. And I guess I didn't read all of it, but I felt like I was like a Foucauldian, and I was like, but where does it go from here? You know, because he's got his hyper pessimistic activism, or, you know, I'm a big fan of that David Halperin book, Saint Foucault, that I don't think people read as an introduction as much anymore, but I think sort of keeps a lot of the political dimensions that is what I really appreciate from it. There was also there was a Purdue conference on Foucault-Deleuze connection in maybe 2012, and I don't know if everything from that's been published yet, you know, but I'll read anything that Dan Smith writes because he's just like so good with the sources, you know. But, you know, as you all know, that they had this sort of like small disagreement that was partially outlined in that letter that Deleuze writes to Foucault on the difference between desire and power, or in desire and pleasure. I think it takes a while for us to really figure out exactly how that debate actually cashes out, but we see it through, let's say, the 90s and 2000s scholarship, where the sort of Foucauldian pleasure and pleasure seeking, I think, finally hits some limits, especially as pleasure becomes just, you know, kind of mundane at a certain point, or that even transgression for its own sake just doesn't seem as interesting or as relevant as maybe it did. And so when trying to figure out how the systems kind of interact, for Foucault, I think the limitation is that, I mean, not that it's a dialectic, but for him, it's still sort of power and resistance. I don't think he sees any outside. And for Deleuze, you know, there's always this nomad that's on the outside. You know, the state has two poles, or whatever has two poles, you know, it's liberal and authoritarian side. And for Deleuze, the nomad seems to have a completely different, like, let's call it, I don't know, a metaphysics or something, than that of the power and its resistance. And so I think that that's where we start seeing the sort of divergence between the two approaches. Because otherwise, Foucault fits quite nicely within a Deleuzean paradigm. And, you know, he brings them up when it's appropriate, and it seems to make a lot of sense. I think just Foucault was maybe not really interested in sort of the beyond or the outside in any way. And so to find that, like I was looking for, I think, you know, a Deleuze or someone else is the person who finally sort of tries to do that. I don't know if he's successful or not, but I mean, Foucault tried, I guess, with that one Blanchot essay, but, you know, it seems just kind of elliptical to me.
Yeah,
maybe imperceptibility may one way of finding being inside, like because if you look at like the spaces of enclosure and sort of controlled spaces, the major difference is that you cannot really be inside, or the inside outside sort of thing is kind of collapsing, right? Where you know whether you can be inside or not. I found this dilemma even in Hard and Agree, when they talk about multitude and other things, like kind of coming up with this sort of a resistance politics, where you kind of find that inside space. I think the only inside your sorry outside space, outside space is something which seems to be impossible, right? So I think the only way to kind of form an outside is to be imperceptible, right? In one sense, I think. I don't know whether there is an outside possible. That's my doubt.
Yeah, in the late Deleuze, we get this in a few places, right? So, like in that conversation he has with Negri, where he starts talking about sort of excommunication of sorts, vacuoles of non-communication, the sort of control and becoming stuff. And then in the control essay, the viruses and the temporary silences. I like this Michael Hart essay. It's eventually folded into Empire, but I just like the standalone version of it called The Withering of Civil Society, which he does a comparative reading of Foucault, D&G, and then Morio Tronti. And the conclusion that he comes to is that there's a becoming immanence of capitalism. So if the only sort of alternative or the resistant paradigm we have or something is just immanence, then it's not sort of sufficient. And I often pair this with a reading by this Canadian geographer, Sue Ruddock, in which she calls it the politics of affect. But I think she just read all of the affect studies writing that was maybe between 2006 and 2010 and then writes this essay. And she goes to the figure of the scream, you know, like from the Francis Bacon paintings. And Deleuze in some of his lectures talks about it in a few places too, where he's just like, the job of the philosopher is not to be the thinker or giving the answers, but to scream, to shake us out of our slumber, you know, in the ways in which we often talk about people in their dogmatic slumber. And it's like, I love that. It's just like either to be silent or to scream. Those are the two places we get to inhabit, I guess.
Well, I think actually the time is passing. So any more question, Dave? Do you have?
Yeah, I just had one question, Andrew. It's just when you were talking about the low tech, and it kind of made me think of things like social ecology, the Bookchin kind of connection there with obviously Guattari's more solo work, which has quite a strong political edge, or Aninas and the kind of deep ecology movements, things like that. Do you have any time for those sorts of things, or even degrowth? Came from the 70s, obviously Gorse, and then has been updated with Callis and people like that. Do you see this as part of your refusal or your politics?
I like it. It's like not my style, but I leave space for it. Maybe that's the way I'd sort of propose it. Like I know plenty of people who are in it, you know, just like the way my life intersects with others. I think that it's important. One of my greatest friends from grad school before he went back to school got permaculture certification and teaches like agriculture and grow stuff in low income areas, and is actually doing some, I think, more like regional planning type stuff these days. And so I think that it's really important. There's also a funny sort of connection. I know you brought up Bateson already, but there's this great book that I'm sure you all have read by Fred Turner on From the Counterculture to the Cyberculture. And it's this tracking of how Bateson and that whole sort of like post-Macy convention anthropology crew then gets brought up by like California hippies and the whole Earth catalog and everything that would become sort of green ecology and that sort of thinking here, and then gets imported into Silicon Valley and computer culture, and that its politics and its social agenda sort of goes back and forth. It's completely unpredictable, and maybe that's the Guattarian thing, you know, that like it's supposed to be transversal. You never know where these connections are going to go, and that it's up for debate, and that's what makes it interesting. In politics is the helping push it in one direction rather than the other, I guess. Yeah, and I think degrowth is ultimately the only thing that we can do. As I tell my students every semester, you know, someone tried to make an ethically sourced smartphone and they couldn't. there's just, if we were to live in a world that we want to live in, there's so many things that we're going to have to stop doing and find new and better ways to do it. And I think the degrowth approach and the ways of living with different access to resources, with a different relationship with the world around us, I think that's going to be a big part of it. And maybe a figure that I like about this is who thinks about this well is Isabel Stengers. I really like her recent stuff on like challenging our notions of Gaia or ecology, thinking of it as this actually terrifying figure rather than this just nurturing one, and figuring out how to really what it means for us.
All right. So Manoji, wrap up our event.
Is there any plan to kind of have a reading from his side of this book, or like just we kind of wrap up?
I can do it if you want, or if you want to wrap it up, you can wrap it up too.
It's up to Alex, or what do you want to do?
I have time. I could do it. I could just read maybe the opening, and then part of one of the early sections as kind of a teaser, and then we'll call it. I'd take too much time. Mm-hmm. So I'll note that most of the book is very episodic. The three body parts have some both short and long segments. I wrote it. I don't think it ended up in the back copy, but I said that you could sort of read those sections on the go on your way somewhere, like on the subway or something. Whereas the introduction really is a fully formed, 10,000 word essay. And so I call that underground philosophy. And I say that the most important movements now pose no demands. And then in the midst are those who refuse labels. Joining them together is the notion that there can be no political solution. Their ranks swell in riots that now fill the streets. They reverberate through prisons, simmer in refugee detention camps. The passion is felt in the red-hot rage of radical queers who respond by bashing back. And it has spread like wildfire before. Just a decade before, the movements of the squares toppled many governments. And it continues daily in those who insist that Black Lives Matter. What is most curious of all is that in the midst of so much refusal, so many of their hearts are still moved by the language of revolution. But even while change is coming, as Gil Scott-Heron has noted, the revolution will not be televised. It will not ask for time in the next presidential debate. It will not be interviewed on the front page of your favorite news site. Though they might try, it will not be included in any party's platform. Even those grassroots organization, quote, working on the neighborhood level will not be recognized. It is the politics of the unseen, and this book is for them. I make a media argument then about the sort of changing landscape, the acceleration of time, the fact that Facebook now thinks in the 1 trillionth of a second. And then here's my proposal for under space ground. Conceptually, this book poses a different path than those who just seek to overcome power. One outlined in the ideas of Deleuze and Guattari. 40 years after they published 1,000 Plateaus, it seems that most readers have gotten lost along the way, however. Many lose their place and get their heads trapped up in the clouds just after reading the first 2 lines. Quote, 2 of us wrote Anti-Oedipus together. Since each of us was several, there was already quite a crowd. Shock of these opening lines stops liberals in the tracks, who pause to delight in the seeming defense of plurality. Starry-eyed cosmopolitans quickly join the party, incapable of turning down an opportunity to stare deeply into the universe in the search of new cosmic bodies. Speaking Deleuze and Guattari like an incantation, they wax poetically about the human body not being a single self-contained organism, but a complex ecosystem whose population includes not just a number of organs, but a substantial amount of liquids or other organic matter made up of a variety of molecules, themselves serving as a habitat for communities of microorganisms residing within the skin, mouth, lungs, eyelids, gut, and reproductive system. Too many just stop here, sufficiently amazed by the sudden multiplication to take this rather simple shift in perspective as the most important trick of the book. To read the book as a trip through a kaleidoscopic complexity of the world is to miss the point, I argue. D&G themselves state as much a few pages later, for those still reading, quote, "In the truth, it is not enough to say, long live the multiple, for the multiple must be made. They follow us up with an even more scandalous statement on method. Multiplication is not the result of adding new dimensions to the world, as in tacking an S on everything of a suffix, such as just increasing a viewing angle, but subtracting from it. Subtraction is the political science of the underground. D&G define it precisely as the operation of the n minus 1. With it, they propose a two-step process, first determining or locating the determinants that hold a system together, and then second, subtracting a dimension from that system, pushing it into crisis. This two-step process of subtraction is strategic, not moral or ponderous. It is not transfixed by earthly appearances. It fragments the world, frustrating synthesis, tearing down a cybernetic perch of angels, human, animal, or machine, that might offer unified synoptic view. If it is trapped in the world of representation, it is only as partisans operating behind enemy lines. Partisans respond tactically, appropriating the most cutting-edge technology like the Bono gang did with the automobiles and repeating rifles, a famous sort of like anarchist group who did some robberies with, high tech. The point is neither to sing like a mystic about the rhapsody of sensations, nor to stand in judgment, which only fuel cheap self-righteousness of legislative philosophers, instead of making incursions under the cover of night. So that's just a little entree into the book.
Good. Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew Culp, for joining us and for this engaging discussion. And thanks, Alex, Geoff, and Dave, my colleagues, for being with us throughout. And I think that, this book sets out a new politics, a new reading of Deleuze and Guattari's politics. Of course, there could be different ways of reading it. One in waiting is Alex's book on Deleuze and Guattari on politics. So just waiting for that desperately. And on that note, I think to the politics of subtractive communism, to the politics of multiplicity, cheers to that. And
right. We will meet next month as well.
Yeah.
Toulouse Guattari conference in India also.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Must advertise. All right, see you
Absolutely.
there. Yeah. Absolutely, yeah.
So see you, Dave. See you, Andrew, Alex, Geoff.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Fantastic.
Awesome.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much. This was amazing.
See you later.
Superb. Yeah. Take care.
If you saw any typos, let me know. I still have a couple weeks to submit proofs.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Stay safe.
Bye.
Everybody.